Iran's army chooses this coast for a landing. First, the Tel Aviv coast is heavily bombarded by ships. Then, Iranian aircraft drop 10,010 bombs on the coast. After that, Iranian soldiers begin to land on the coast with boats and dinghies. Israel's machine guns immediately open fire, and the Iranian soldiers landing on the coast are hunted down like birds. At the same time, tank bombardment completely halts the advance of Iranian soldiers on the coast. However, Iran deploys land-to-land tanks from the ships, easing the soldiers' advance. Iranian soldiers, using tanks as cover, quickly begin to capture Israeli positions. Israeli soldiers completely withdraw from the coastline and start taking positions within the city. While all this is happening, Turkish and Pakistani soldiers parachute from planes and take complete control of Gaza. In the West Bank, the Palestinian people launch an uprising, seize the government, and take the country out of Israel's control. Turkish and Pakistani soldiers want to establish a land connection with the West Bank, so they begin to attack this region very fiercely. However, the Pakistani army prefers to stay in Gaza to ensure its security instead of attacking. The Turkish army, after advancing a little, encounters an Israeli counterattack and is forced to retreat back to the Gaza Strip. Israel wants to retake Gaza, so it attacks Gaza with a force of 50,000 soldiers, but due to the strong resistance of Pakistani soldiers, Israel cannot take Gaza. The Turkish army attacks again, and a land connection with the West Bank is established. As Syria attacks and advances on the Golan Heights, Israel begins to send half of its soldiers in Tel Aviv towards the Golan Heights. Taking this as an opportunity, the Iranian army advances with 100,000 soldiers towards the center of Tel Aviv and completely captures the city. Israel then advances towards Tel Aviv with 100,000 soldiers and besieges the Iranian soldiers in the city of Tel Aviv. Syria, with tanks received from Russia, gains superiority on the Golan Heights, routs the Israeli soldiers, and begins to advance towards the center of the country. Israeli soldiers launch an air attack on the besieged Iranian soldiers. As a result of this air attack, the 100,000-strong Iranian army is reduced to 80,000 soldiers. Syria also receives support from Russia and begins to advance further into Israeli territory. Israel receives support from the United States, defeats the Syrian army, and reclaims all its territory up to the Golan Heights. Thereupon, Syria mines everywhere in the Golan Heights and withdraws from the region. As Israeli soldiers begin to advance north from the Golan Heights, the mines explode, and they are forced to retreat with heavy losses. Taking this as an opportunity, the Syrian army attacks and begins to advance. Meanwhile, the Pakistani army in Gaza advances towards the city of Ashkelon and completely captures the city. The Iranian army in Tel Aviv attacks along the coast and captures these cities. Iranian soldiers establish a land connection with the Lebanese borders and continue to attack, taking territory from Israel. The Turkish army continued to advance north. At this time, as the Iranian army began to advance toward the city of Ashdod, attacking Iranian aircraft dropped 2,000 tons of bombs on the city of Ashdod. Then, after intense clashes, Iranian soldiers completely captured the city. As the Turkish army arrived before Jerusalem, Israeli soldiers counterattack, and Turkish soldiers are forced to retreat a little. However, with support of Pakistani soldiers, Turkish soldiers attack again and capture Jerusalem, known as the Holy Land. After this date, a large part of the war ends, and all Muslim armies attack towards the southern territories. These territories would be a special region belonging to Turkey, Pakistan, Iran, and Syria, where Muslims and Jews would live together. The United States, bewildered by the situation, goes into a frenzy and sends 100 warships towards the Mediterranean. At the same time, fighter jets taking off from America's military base in Iraq begin to bomb the locations of Turkish, Pakistani, Iranian, and Syrian soldiers. As American warships pass through the Strait of Gibraltar to enter the Mediterranean, they are subjected to an air attack by German fighter jets. As a result of this air attack, the American Navy, consisting of 100 ships, is sunk into the cold waters of the Mediterranean. On the Spanish front, the Allied forces also receive aid from the United Kingdom and form a large-scale defensive area against the Germans on this line. Portugal and Spain gather all their tanks in their countries and send them to the battlefield. Germany also sends a large number of tanks produced in its factories to the region. In the Balkans, 25,000 soldiers from the Serbian army begin to advance from the Bosnia and Herzegovina borders. However, Bosnia and Herzegovina and its allies, to directly finish off Serbia, attack with an army of 400,000 soldiers from the Bulgarian borders. And this army captures all Serbian territories, including the capital Belgrade. In the Caucasus, the ceasefire agreement has expired, and the parties mutually declare war on each other again. First, the Russians attack to completely capture the Georgian territories with a force of 500,000 soldiers and 300 tanks. Turkish and Azerbaijani soldiers, despite trying to resist, could not withstand this Russian force and were forced to retreat. The Russians advanced so quickly that they completely captured the Georgian territories in a short time. Then, the Russians, uniting with the Armenians, began to advance from the Turkish borders, and the Armenians and Russians captured Kars, Ardahan, and Artvin. Then, the unstoppable Russian army also occupied Rize, Erzurum, and Armenia, using its entire army and with the support of Russia, captured Mus, Tatvan, and Van. Azerbaijan, taking advantage of the Armenian army being in Turkey, begins to advance into Armenian territory from the border regions named Nakhchivan and Kapan to the north. Armenia withdraws its army from Turkish territory and leaves the occupied regions under Russian control. Turkey, not wanting to lose more territory in the Caucasus, adopted a defensive stance on these borders with a strong tank army. The Azerbaijani army continues to take territory from Armenia and reaches the outskirts of the capital Yerevan. However, when the Armenian army arrives in the region, very fierce clashes occur here. Meanwhile, the Russians launch an attack to collapse Turkey's defense but failed and retreated. Turkey sends a large number of armed forces from its army to the region and waits for the right time to attack. At the same time, Turkey withdraws some of its soldiers in the Middle East and sends them to the Caucasus front. Russia, instead of attacking, had now taken defensive position. In the Balkans, Croatia, learning that Serbia was defeated, withdraws from the war and declares its neutrality. In the Mediterranean, a Turkish seismic research vessel is sunk by a Greek F-16. Given this situation, Turkey is forced to declare war on Greece. Since Turkey was fighting with all its might against Russia in the east, it was not in a state to fight with Greece. However, in response to a possible Greek attack, Turkey sends some soldiers from the eastern front to the west to its border with Greece. Russia, to exploit this situation, attacks towards Turkish territory. Turkey now had to join the war either on the side of the Germans or the Allies. Otherwise, it could be occupied by Russia. Germany made a call to Turkey: join the war on our side, and nothing can happen to you. The Allies told Turkey, we can fight Russia in the east. You can handle Greece in the west during this time. Turkey now had to make a decision. The Azerbaijani army fails against the Russians on these borders and is forced to retreat. Russia advances by occupying the northern region of Azerbaijan. Germany was producing so many tanks everywhere in its country that it eventually had more than 3,000 tanks. Germany was preparing a strong attack plan to capture the Iberian Peninsula and Portugal. For this, Germany sends 500 of the 3,000 tanks it produced to the Spanish front. At the same time, it arms hundreds of thousands of volunteers gathered from its people and sends them to the region. The German armies are now many times stronger against the Allies, and as the Allies anticipated, the German armies attack, and the Allied army is routed. In this way, Germany advances rapidly and completely captures the Iberian Peninsula and Portugal. Meanwhile, to stop Russia's advance, Azerbaijan sends its soldiers from the Armenian borders to the regions under Russian occupation. Armenia takes advantage of the situation and advances from these borders, reclaiming its lost territories. In the north, Azerbaijan successfully stopped Russia's advance. Russia, to deliver a decisive blow to Turkey, advanced towards the Turkish borders with a force of 2,000 tanks and 600,000 soldiers. It was time for Turkey to choose a side. If it joined the war on the side of the Allies, it would have to withdraw from the Middle East. But if it joined the war on the side of the Germans, it could seize the opportunity to expand its territories. After some thought, Turkey decides that the most correct decision is to join the war on the side of the Germans. However, for Germany to send aid to Turkey, it had to pass through European and Balkan territories. We have reached the end of Part 3 of World War III. See you in Part 4.